Welcome everybody. I'm really glad to see the turnout that we have. I'm expecting some folks, we set this so that people leaving work might stop by, have their dinner with us, and appreciate our speakers' remarks. I am the coordinator. I've been at this 6 years, so ask me if you have a question, and I think I can probably answer it, especially if you don't find anything redeeming about the highway, because I find nothing redeeming about this project. And I want to tell you that I'm really angry because it's been reported to me. We had a news conference this morning, and Channel 13, WTVG, covered the news conference, but they of course reached out to ODOT for an ODOT viewpoint, and ODOT is saying there's absolutely no harm. On the media, on the news at 4 or 5 this afternoon, there is no harms to this highway. I want you to hear Dr. Ryan, and you tell me afterwards if there's no harms to being in close proximity to a highway. So I'm fired up now more than I was before, because we don't need to hear their point of view. We need to hear the point of view of the experts. Many of you don't know, right now, the costs are now at $250,000 and going up. And that doesn't include property acquisition, and we have no idea. They will not reveal to people whose property is going to be taken or how much. The project is 6 lanes from Douglas Road to US 23, except in the area between Secord and Talmadge, they wanted 8 lanes wide. The cost, as I said, is $250 million. It's 4.5 years of construction gridlock. ODOT presents nothing but misleading data. If you're doubting what I'm saying, come see me. I'll show you the data. I have it with me. The environmental degradation that's there, and not the least of which is the health impacts that are going to be felt by everybody in their 5 square mile project area. That's about 15,000 people in their project area. It is the most densely residential neighborhoods on the entire Beltway. And we believe that the people who live there count more than the commerce, which is one of their reasons for doing this. More commerce, more commerce. My health is more important to me than your 2-hour delivery of a plastic dish pan. Sorry, that's how I feel, okay? And the health of my family and the health of my neighbors is more important than more fast delivery everywhere. 2 things by themselves should have stopped this project. I'm going to read you the first one, and you might have seen it on the screen. This is from ODOT, early on. The area is surrounded predominantly by residential properties. Census demographic data shows that there are larger volumes of elderly populations aged 65 and older living in the areas surrounding the corridor. There are also some areas along the corridor with higher concentrations of lower income individuals with limited English proficiency and minority populations. In other words, the same vulnerable people who get stuck in the middle of everything that we do that is wrong, particularly for human health. The second thing is ODOT themselves admits that highways are carcinogenic. They did an air quality analysis in October of 2024. It is up at the project website. You can go read it for yourself. But on page 1, they admit that there are 9 EPA-identified compounds that come off of highways that are carcinogenic. So between which populations they were going to be harming and carcinogenic introduction more than we already have in our environment, should have stopped this project immediately. But they just keep pushing on and on and on. And for them to say, when they say on one hand that it's carcinogenic and they identify it as such, and then go on the news tonight and say there's no health harms here, maybe you understand why I'm fired up. I'll leave it at that. I know you came to hear Patrick Ryan. We have an impressive speaker tonight. Patrick Ryan is an Ohioan through and through, although I did hear he was born in Indiana. But he received his undergrad, his master's, and his doctorate all in Cincinnati. For 25 years, Dr. Ryan has spent his career focused on air pollutants and how they affect pediatric health and neurodevelopment. His goals have been these. 1, how do we accurately characterize exposure to environmental pollutants, especially air pollutants? And 2, what is the impact for health effects of these environmental exposures? Dr. Ryan developed the first land use regression model of elemental carbon, a traffic-related pollutant, which is widely used by the CCAPS pollution study at Cincinnati Children's Hospital to assess childhood exposures to traffic-related pollution, linking it to both asthma and other respiratory diseases, as well as mental health, including anxiety and depression in children. Dr. Ryan's research has been supported by the National Institute of Health, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Health Effects Institute. His research has been published in more than 100 peer-reviewed papers. He has a great name for St. Patrick's Week, and we warmly welcome him to Toledo, Dr. Patrick Ryan.
Peggy mentioned I'm an environmental epidemiologist, so that means I study how environmental exposures influence health outcomes in people. I work at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. Most of the work that I do is focused on childhood health, although I've done some work with adults. But in general, I'm interested in how environmental exposures, air pollution, but other exposures influence health outcomes. And I think the framework of environmental exposures falls under this idea of social determinants of health. And you may have heard of this before, maybe not. But this is the idea that there are a wide array of influences that are out there external to genetics or epigenetics or those types of biological underpinnings, which are very, very important. But there are a wider set of social factors that influence health outcomes. And this term, social determinants of health, comes from the NIH, it comes from the government, whether they want to use these languages now or not, but the idea here, that figure comes from the NIH. And the idea that economic stability, your neighborhood, your access to health care, all of those influences health outcomes. And I think most people intuitively know that, but it's just become in the last couple decades that we really start to study how those exposures influence health outcomes. So air pollution certainly falls under this idea of social determinants of health, but other things, community characteristics, your neighborhood, whether you have access to healthy food, green space. I saw a table back there about trees, so we're really interested in how green space, tree canopy influences health outcomes. Population density, crime. So if you live in a neighborhood that has a lot of crime nearby, that causes a lot of stress, and that causes health outcomes in kids too. But certainly air pollution that we talk about, that we're going to talk about today is one of these things. So I just wanted to start by acknowledging that air pollution is just one aspect of the environment, the social determinants of health that influence health outcomes. I'm going to give a little bit of background because I don't know where everybody's expertise is on air pollution. So what I want to do for the next 5 or 6 slides is just talk about air pollution in general, and then we'll dive into some of the near highway exposure work that we've done in Cincinnati looking at health outcomes. So air pollution, it's a very broad term. It covers a lot of different chemical toxicant exposures. So we typically break air pollution into 2 categories. One is particle pollution, so you might have heard the term PM, PM10, PM2.5, particulate matter, and then gaseous pollutants. So let's talk a little bit about particle pollution. Usually we talk about it in terms of its size. So PM10, PM2.5. They can be solid particles, they can be liquid particles. And this is really important, and we'll talk more about it in a second. The composition of the particles is really important for health outcomes. So where the particles come from influence how they're formed, what they look like, and the chemicals that are on the particles that then lead to health outcomes. Okay? So PM10, it's an EPA-regulated air pollutant. It means that the particle is 10 microns in size or less. So for some perspective, a human hair is about 70 microns in diameter, okay? So PM10 is 1/7 the width of a human hair. So 7 particles basically across a human hair. So small particles, things like pollen, mold, those are particles that fall into that PM10 category. PM2.5 is another EPA-regulated size fraction of particles. 2.5 stands for 2.5 microns. So those are the particles that are less than 2.5 microns in diameter. So again, human hair, 2.5 microns is about 1/30th the width of a human hair. So very, very small particles. And we'll talk about in a second why the size of the particle matters for health. PM 2.5 is usually derived from burning things. So traffic produces PM 2.5. When you burn diesel, when you burn gasoline, when you burn coal, when you burn fossil fuels, you're producing PM 2.5. Smoking, if you smoke cigarettes, you will get PM 2.5. You're burning an organic material, it causes those particles to be produced. There is another size of particle that I'm going to mention today called ultrafine particles also. Ultrafine particles are not regulated by the EPA. But they're of interest to me and many other health researchers because they are so small that they can actually cross into the circulatory system, go to organs of the body like the heart, the brain, and cause other health effects, not just in the lungs. So ultrafine particles are 100 nanometers in diameter or less. So these are particles that are PM 0.1. orders of magnitude smaller. And the reason I'm mentioning it here today in this audience is because diesel exhaust particles, when they're fresh, when you're standing next to an idling bus or an idling truck right next to it, the particles that are being emitted, directly emitted from those sources, the diesel particles, are mostly ultrafine in size. So the vast number of the particles that are being produced, if you count them, are ultrafine in size, okay? They're not regulated. They're very hard to measure. We do some studies using very expensive devices to measure those. They're not regulated by the EPA. So most of the stuff that you're going to hear today are not ultrafines, but I just want you to know that they are out there. It's something that we're thinking about for health effects. And the reason that we're, again, worried about them is because of their size. So why do we focus on the size of the particle? The size, for two reasons. One, the composition of the particle varies according to the size. So if you think about, the analogy that I use a lot is if you take an ice cube or a sugar cube, for example. You take a cube and you measure its surface area. And that cube has a certain size before you smash it. And you smash that cube and it creates all those little sugar granules. All of a sudden you've increased the same particle that you started with, that cube. When you smash it into all those little small particles, the surface area has increased. So that's important because the more the surface area, it still weighs the same amount. You put all those particles back in, you weigh it, it still weighs the same amount. But now you have all the little ones with all the surfaces exposed. That allows all these compounds to be attached to the top of that surface. And that's important because when you breathe the particles in, you're not just breathing the particle, but you're breathing everything that's been attached to that particle. The polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, the metals, all of those things are attached to the surface. So the smaller the particle, the more surface area per same unit of mass, and it carries with it those same allergens and metals and aromatic hydrocarbons. The second reason it's really important to think about particle size is because the size of the particle is partly responsible for where it ends up in your body. So the PM10, the larger particles, those generally get stuck in the upper airways. So your upper airways filter those out, and you end up having maybe some runny nose, some of those allergic type of disease outcomes, sneezing, headaches, those types of things in the upper airway. The smaller particles get deeper into the airway, and when we do these talks with kids, we'll do a little experiment. We'll hand them sugar cubes, and we'll give them a piece of paper, and we'll ask them to fold the piece of paper into a cone. And if you take a sugar cube and you drop it into the cone, it gets stuck, right? It doesn't come out the bottom. But if you take that same sugar cube, smash it up, and drop all those little pieces of sugar, it comes out the bottom. And if the cone is like your lungs, the analogy is those particles get all the way down in there and into the deepest airways of the lungs. And that's what this figure is showing. And that's why the ultrafine particles are even more, we think, health relevant, because they can get into the very, very lowest part of the lungs where the gas exchange regions are and cause health effects. Okay? So composition, and size is why we're focusing on particle exposures. Okay, so where do they come from? Obviously traffic, we're here talking about traffic exposures, cigarette exposures. Brake wear is one thing you're going to want to think about. When you hit the brakes or when your tires are just running along the road, you're creating particles just from that. That's why electric vehicles, I drive an EV, electric vehicles still produce particles because you're producing those from the tire wear and the brake wear. Industrial sources, there are indoor sources of particles also, cooking, gas stoves, gas furnaces. If you're burning a fossil fuel, you're producing some particles. And again, where they come from influence the health effects. CO, NO2, or NOx's, sulfide, SOx's, and ozone. In addition to those, there are other pollutants that you've heard mentioned today, some of those carcinogenic pollutants that Peggy mentioned. Benzene, xylenes, metals, arsenic, lead. All of those things are out there in the air that you're breathing. So the takeaway is it's a complex picture of particles and gaseous pollutants that affect health outcomes.
Patrick, I'll say one thing, and that is when the ODOT did their MSAT analysis, they listed 9 compounds. I'm seeing them on there, and they flat out say they're carcinogenic. It's not, could be, maybe. These are the carcinogenic compounds that come from highways that the EPA has identified, and I'm seeing the names of them up there. So just keep that in mind.
So I'm going to give you the punchline to this talk right up front. We'll dive into details later, but if you stop paying attention, you fall asleep, or you need to leave, this is the takeaway right here. Air pollution is bad for your health. It is a ubiquitous exposure. We are all breathing it to some effect. We're breathing it inside here to a certain level. When you go outside, you're going to breathe it. When you go near a highway, you're going to breathe it. It is everywhere. We're all exposed to it. So for that reason, the health effects that are associated with air pollution are very wide-ranging and affect a lot of people. Long-term exposures. The epidemiologic evidence is very clear that exposure to air pollution, especially PM 2.5, those smaller particles, is associated with increased risk of death, cardiovascular disease, asthma, lung cancer, and emerging evidence on mental health. So I'm going to talk a lot about the research we're doing on neurodevelopmental outcomes in kids. Short-term exposures, so bad air quality days. So when you might hear, you get air quality alerts, the local EPA comes out, or public health department comes out with an air quality alert. Air pollution is bad today. A short-term exposure to high levels of air pollution is associated with the exacerbation of asthma. So kids who have asthma and there's a bad air quality day, that can exacerbate their asthma, cause an asthma attack. Episodes of mental health, triggers of mental health exacerbations. Air pollution is one of those. Stroke, myocardial infarction, heart attacks, all associated with short-term exposures to higher levels of air pollution. The other thing I'll mention is air pollution is not equitably distributed across areas in the United States. And I can show you lots of our data, lots of data from other people that show there are higher and lower levels of air pollution, and those levels are correlated with neighborhoods that have higher proportions of lower income residents and minority residents, black and brown, immigrant populations. Those neighborhoods have higher levels of air pollution for a number of reasons that we can talk about. I'm happy to go into it. We have lots of data there. These slides, these pictures come from a Health Effects Institute and the American Lung Association report about air pollution that kind of combines all the research that's been done across the world. And now they're estimating air pollution is the second leading risk factor for early death. Only high blood pressure is more. That is worldwide. So keep in mind, we're not just talking about the United States here, but worldwide for that figure. Let's start diving into traffic-related air pollution and some of the work that we've been doing. Traffic-related air pollution is this sort of catch-all term that we use to talk about the specific pollutants that are coming from burning gasoline and diesel from cars and trucks and buses. You might also hear this term near roadway pollution. And the reason we talk about traffic-related pollution as being a near roadway pollution is this figure right here. And I hope you can see this in the back. But if nothing else, this figure is probably one of the more important things to take away today. Because what this is showing is each one of these lines is a different air pollutant that has been measured and the x-axis is the distance from the source, so the distance from the roadway. And what it's showing is there are some air pollutants that don't have this spatial gradient of exposure. So PM 2.5 is this line here, and you can see that there is some higher levels of PM 2.5 near a highway. And that's because traffic does produce some PM 2.5. But you don't see this type of distribution right here because there are lots of sources of PM 2.5.
Can you tell us what the distances are?
Yeah, sorry. So this is 400. The longest hash here is 400, and we'll talk more about that. 400 meters. Yeah, so if you look at some of these distances that you see here, the idea, these are the traffic pollutants, the elemental carbon, diesel exhaust particles. This is a schematic of a diesel exhaust particle. The core of a diesel exhaust particle is elemental carbon. And then attached to that core is other compounds, metals, and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. But elemental carbon is a pollutant that looks like this. So very high near its source, and by the time you get 300 to 400 meters away from that source, the road, you reach that background level where it flattens out. So that's why we call it near roadway pollution. If you're near the roadway, you have a high exposure, and as you move far away from the roadway, you don't have the same level of exposure. And that's for a couple of reasons. Wind patterns distributes it, the particles hit themselves and become bigger, they fall out, atmospheric transformations and things like that. But the takeaway is, these are the traffic-related pollutants. The ultrafine particles, nitrogen oxides, NO2, elemental carbon, CO, those are the pollutants that have that near roadway, high levels of exposure really close to the highway.
Are burning gasoline, does that produce the ultrafine particles?
So it does, but to a much lower extent than diesel exhaust. So gasoline does produce some of that, but not nearly as many as diesel. So in Cincinnati, we have had a study going on since 2001 called the Cincinnati Childhood Allergy and Air Pollution Study, or the CAPS study. CAPS was originally designed to look at whether children who are exposed to traffic-related air pollution, and specifically, and there's a couple reasons why, specifically we are interested in diesel exhaust particles, and whether or not those kids that were born and live very close to the interstates, and in our case, that very close is less than 400 meters, are more likely or at increased risk for developing allergic diseases, asthma, and having adverse neurodevelopmental outcomes. So Cincinnati's similar to Toledo. We have major highways that come through the region. 75 goes right through Cincinnati, Interstate 71, 275, and we had a large population of people that are living near those interstate highways. We designed the study specifically to look at those kids that were born there and lived there early in their life when they're developing, their lungs are developing, their brains are developing, whether they're at higher risk for developing allergic diseases and asthma and neurodevelopmental outcomes. In epidemiologic studies, we have different study designs. The study design here is a cohort study, which means we recruited all of these kids shortly after their birth using their birth record addresses. So we went out and knocked on doors and sent them letters and said, will you be in the study? And they were eligible to be in the study if they lived less than 400 meters from a major road. So those are the kids that we thought were going to be the highest exposed. And then if they lived less or greater than 1,500 meters from a major road, and those were our control kids. So those are the kids that we thought were not exposed to air pollution because of that steep gradient that I showed you in that last slide. They live far enough away that we didn't think they were going to be exposed to the air pollution that's coming from the highway.
Just to confirm your hypothesis, did you by any chance take some air samples?
We did.
Okay.
We did a lot of air sampling. These distances were based on that figure I showed you before from other studies, but we did our own studies also. We published that. I'm happy to share that paper with you if you want. We took a particle counter to do that study, so we just counted all particles, including the ultrafines, and did it at different distances, and then plotted it. So we saw the same effect. Other studies have done this same type of design. The cut point we used is 400 meters. There's a study in Boston. I think they used 300 meters, and I think the reason they did that is they have more people that live right on top of the interstate, so they could actually do that and get the same, get an exposed group. But that 400 meters is generally the exposed area, and we do have the data to support the 400 meter cut point. I'm happy to share that with you. It's on our website too.
Aren't small particulate matter precursors to other air pollutants like ozone and things like that?
Not ozone. Ozone is a secondary pollutant that's formed in the atmosphere, so it's not directly emitted from vehicles, but it's formed from VOCs. So that's one component of vehicle exhaust, put out VOCs, volatile organic compounds. Nitrogen oxides, another vehicle exhaust primary pollutant, and then it needs sunlight and high temperatures to form the ozone as a secondary pollutant. So ozone they call it a secondary pollutant because it's not emitted, it's formed in the atmosphere from those precursors, not the particulate matter. It's VOCs and NOxs. So let me go back, just so you know, we've been following, I call them these kids. We've actually are still following them now. We have a study that we're bringing them back in, and they're in their early 20, they're 25, some of them right now. We're still following them, looking for health outcomes, looking at their allergic disease, asthma, and mental health outcomes. We see them we saw them when they were 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 12, 14 to 17, and now 20 plus, okay? So we've been following them throughout their life. We have a lot of data on them. We have health data on them. We went to their homes. We've collected dust. We know what their mold exposure was like. We know what their microbiome is like. We have lots of air pollution data that I'm going to show you for these kids. We collect toenails and teeth and hair. We've measured genetics and you name it. We've measured it on these kids. So we have a lot of data on them. Actually, this is the first paper I ever published in 2004. What we did was we wanted to look at, forget about modeling air pollution, we just want to look at if you live close to different types of traffic, what's that mean for the health of these kids? What we did, what I'm going to show you here in these next slides, is we categorized them into 3 groups. Kids that lived very close to what we called stop and go traffic patterns. So those are, and we defined those as roads that had a numeric number, so I don't know what they are in Toledo, but it's basically a state highway, but there's stoplights. So it's a busy road, but they had a stop and go traffic pattern. And if you can see these black dots on this picture, that's those kids in our study in Cincinnati. So we drew 100 meters on either side. If they live next to it, within 100 meters, we said you were exposed to stop and go traffic. Then we had another category of kids, and those are the kids that lived near moving traffic. So these are the interstate highways. These are the kids in Cincinnati, if you're familiar with it. In this picture, this is the downtown area. This is I-75. This is 74, 71. So these black dots are the kids that lived less than 400 meters from those moving traffic, high volume streets. And then we had the kids that were what we considered at the time unexposed. They didn't live near either the highways or the stop and go. So that was our control group that we're going to compare them to. And this is what we saw in this first analysis. So what we're looking at here is wheezing in the first year of life. Parent report that their child wheezed in the first year of life without a cold or a viral infection. What we saw was 2 things to take away. First, as you move from the unexposed to the moving to the stop and go, you see this increased risk. This is the percent of kids that wheezed. So it's a significant increase across the categories. And the highest rates of wheezing were in the kids that lived near that stop and go traffic pattern. Those were bus routes also, by the way. And the other thing to take away, and this is something that we see across studies, in our study and across the United States, even in the first year of life, black kids wheezed at significantly higher rates than the white kids in our study. So you can see that across all 3 categories, and the highest rates of wheezing were the black kids who lived in the stop and go traffic pattern. Where do you live relative to the nearest streets? Somebody asked about air pollution modeling. We've done a lot of air sampling in Cincinnati to try to better understand what diesel exhaust exposure looks like in the city. The way we did this was we put out 27 sampling sites. Most cities have EPA sampling sites, and I'm going to talk about this. Usually, maybe, I bet Toledo has, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4, I don't know. Usually Cincinnati has about 6 or 7 at any given time. A big city, Not a whole lot of sampling sites. We put out our own sampling sites, 27 of them, and we measured elemental carbon. If you remember, elemental carbon is the core of the diesel exhaust particle. So most of the elemental carbon in the air comes from diesel. So that's our marker of diesel exhaust particles, is elemental carbon. And then what we did was we modeled it. So Peggy mentioned we developed what's called a land use regression model. I won't go into the details, but what it does is allow us to use the data that we collected at our sampling sites and create a map that estimates the amount of diesel exhaust particle exposure throughout the entire city of Cincinnati. In this figure, you're looking at the picture of diesel exhaust particle according to our model. The darker the red, the higher the levels of exposure are. And you can see, if you're familiar with Cincinnati, this almost looks like a map of the city. This is 75. This is Interstate 75. Again, this is the downtown area. This is Interstate 71. They come together in Cincinnati at the Brent Spence Bridge. That's the area right here. It has the highest number of trucks in the city. At the time we were doing this, it had about 60,000 trucks a day at this point right here, which is in northern Kentucky. And you can see the highest exposure, estimated exposures are right there. But you can see the outline of all of our major interstates. That's where the highest levels of diesel exhaust particle exposure were. And we've used that then. The advantage of a model like this is we can actually then estimate how much every one of our kids are exposed to based on this model. And that's what this picture is showing here. So every kid in the study has an estimate of exposure, and then we use that for our health analyses, and I'm going to talk about now. The first one I'm going to show to you is, I know there's a lot of data here, but hopefully I can break it down so it's not overly complicated. But what we did was we estimated the amount of elemental carbon at their home, and then we looked at the risk of wheezing in the first year of life. So the exact same thing we looked at before, but now we're looking at specifically the diesel exhaust particles. The average exposure in Cincinnati is about 0.4 micrograms per cubic meter. At that level of exposure, what we saw was that the kids were at a 50% higher risk of wheezing in the first year of their life. And that's significant, statistically significant. When we put it into our models and we consider all sorts of other things that might be playing a role in their wheezing early in life, we still see that increased risk of wheezing in the first year of life. The other thing we did was like I said, followed these kids throughout their life. And we looked at what their exposures were at birth, in their first year of life, their second year, their third year, and so on and so forth. And then we looked at whether or not they developed asthma when they were 7 years old. And the kids that were exposed to the highest levels of air pollution early in their life, so through age 4, were significantly more likely to develop asthma at age 7 compared to the kids that weren't exposed to the highest levels of air pollution. So that's what these dots are showing you when it's above 1. And they're right around 50% again. So about a 50% increased risk of developing asthma by the time they're 7 years old if they were exposed to traffic-related air pollution early in their life. The takeaway I want you to know here is the CAP study has been involved with a number of other studies across the country. We're involved with a group called Cadre. And you can see these dots are different studies, just like the CAP study, that are going on across the United States. And we've pooled our data. We put it all together at all these different sites. And we looked at it together and said, what does air pollution look like? Is it just one spot, or is it across? Does everybody see the same thing? And it turns out everybody sees the same things. Takeaway here is that we looked at early life exposure in the first year of life through age 2 and age 3. And we see across all the studies about a 20% increased risk of developing asthma by the time the kids are 11 years old if they're exposed to the highest levels of air pollution in their early life. So it's not just our study. Us plus all these other studies see the same thing when we put all of it together. I want to talk a little bit about mental health outcomes, because I think this is probably less recognized than the respiratory outcomes in kids. So in 2007, we were starting to think about what's the next phase of the project that we want to do. And some studies came out of Mexico City from a researcher there they were actually looking at dogs. They were putting dogs that had died from different areas of Mexico City through an MRI. And what this researcher noticed was the dogs that were living, were living in the areas of Mexico City that had the highest levels of air pollution had different brain images than dogs that lived in other less polluted parts of the city. We thought that was interesting, and we started to study neurodevelopmental outcomes in the kids that are in the CAP study. That was 2007. This is a figure from 2009. So within 2 years, researchers had started to look at it in mice and started to see there are a lot of different ways that air pollution can actually affect the brain. 2 primary points. One, the particles, the PM 2.5 and the ultrafine particles, because they're so small, they can cause health effects in the brain in a couple different ways. One is they can actually cross through go so deep in the lungs, cross into the circulatory system, and end up in your brain. So that's one way. The second way is the olfactory bulb. You can actually breathe them, and there's a study that showed that the ultrafines can go directly into the brain through the olfactory bulb. So there's these direct ways that the pollutants can end up in the brain and affect health. Secondly, people started to realize that when you breathe air pollution, your body doesn't like it in a lot of different ways, and it produces what we call an inflammatory response. Your lungs become inflamed, it produces compounds in response to that, but it's not just your lungs. Your brain actually produces some of these neuroinflammatory markers also. There's been a lot of papers now that show a number of these neuroinflammatory markers that are elevated in people who are exposed to higher levels of air pollution. What I want to talk about is, when you're exposed to things early in life, when a child is developing and their lungs are developing and they're exposed to higher levels of air pollution, it's sort of like the butterfly effect, where a small change early in life can lead to a big change later on. Your lungs are developing, you have an environmental exposure that causes a change, you can develop asthma. The brain's the same way. And the classic example is lead. If you're exposed to lead as a child, it causes many health effects, but it causes changes in the brain that can manifest themselves many years later. That's the idea that we wanted to start looking at. And the takeaway here is that at this point, 20 years later, there have been a lot of different studies that have shown this, not just by us, but across the world. So that's what this figure is showing. And what this is showing is all these different outcomes that have been linked now to air pollution exposure. Decreased IQ. So kids that are exposed to higher levels of air pollution across many studies in the world have lower IQ. Executive functioning, decision making. So kids that are exposed to higher levels of air pollution make poorer decisions later in life. Some of the clinical outcomes, autism. So autism has been linked to higher levels of air pollution exposure in kids. What hasn't been studied as much, but now is changing, is mental health outcomes like anxiety and depression. So that's what we started to think about in the next phase of the study. So back to the CAP study, this is just showing you, we started measuring all sorts of things again. I would like to take away from this slide is we also did MRIs. So it's not just questionnaires that we ask the parents to fill out about their kids, but we actually are taking images of their brains so we can look at kids' brains who are exposed to higher levels of air pollution and then compare those to the lower levels of air pollution. Let's talk a little bit about mental health and what we've seen there. When they were 12 years old, they came in and they filled out questionnaires about their anxiety and depression. So these are standardized, validated measures of anxiety and depression. We asked the parents to fill them out about their child, and then we asked the child themselves to fill them out about themselves. They were in different rooms, they were with trained psychometricians. We measured it both as parent report and child report. So the reason I wanted to highlight this is there's not very good agreement between what the parents told us and what the children told us. Parents reported their child to have relatively normal depression and a little bit higher anxiety levels. And when we asked the kids, they reported more depression and much lower anxiety. So the parents thought their kids were more anxious than they were and didn't recognize depression as well as the kids report, as much as the kids reported it. So that's the takeaway, because when we looked at the health data, when we looked at the parents' report of anxiety and depression, we didn't see anything. We saw no significant relationship between air pollution exposure and what the parents told us about their kids. But when we looked at it with what the kids told us, we saw a number of significant outcomes. So depression. So kids who are exposed to higher levels of air pollution early in their life and throughout childhood were significantly more likely to report higher scores on the depression scale than kids who were exposed to lower levels of air pollution. Same thing with the anxiety. Total anxiety, generalized anxiety, and social phobias, all higher in kids who are exposed to higher levels of air pollution early in their life. I want to go back to the MRIs. So we had these child reports that we see this link between air pollution exposure and what the kids were telling us about their anxiety and depression. But what we wanted to see was, well, what about the brain imaging? What does that tell us about the air pollution? And the MRIs measure a whole bunch of different things. We can measure the structure of the brain, the volumes of different areas in the brain, the gray matter, the white matter, but it also can give you some idea about the chemistry of the brain. So we can measure these metabolites of what's going on in the brain activity. And so that's what we wanted to look at in this analysis. Is air pollution, higher levels of air pollution, associated with higher levels of metabolite, chemical compounds in the brain? And so we measured this with MRI, we looked at a whole bunch of different ones, and I'll spare you all of these different chemical compounds, but I'll just highlight the two that we found, myo-inositol and glutathione. Those are important because glutathione is a compound that actually helps combat reactive oxygen species. So when you are exposed to air pollution, your body produces these reactive oxygen species. Glutathione is the compound that helps tap that response down. So we saw glutathione being elevated in the kids that were exposed to higher levels of air pollution, and same with the myo-inositol. And then if you look at the relationship on the other side, are these brain metabolites associated with what the kids are telling us about their symptoms? We saw that myo-inositol really stood out. So the kids that had the highest levels of anxiety, we saw this almost, I mean, this data for us was shocking. I mean, it's this really strong relationship between higher levels of myo-inositol and higher levels of anxiety in the kids. So when you put it all together, we see air pollution associated with the anxiety, and we estimate in this analysis that we did that about 20% of that relationship, the air pollution to the anxiety, is actually going through this pathway in the brain that's affecting the myo-inositol levels. Air pollution is affecting the neuroinflammation, which we're measuring with that myo-inositol, and then we see it in the kids in their reported anxiety symptoms. Throwing this slide up there, we've published now a couple of other papers that it's not just those brain metabolites, but we actually do see changes in the volume and the cortical thickness in kids who are exposed to higher levels of air pollution. And these are the images on the MRI. So we see these structural changes in kids that are exposed to higher levels of air pollution in the imaging themselves. So everything I've talked about is the CAP study. Everything that we've talked about so far is like these long-term average exposures. So where you live, you've lived there for years, you're exposed to air pollution day after day, higher levels, affects these chronic outcomes. But what about the short-term exposures? Asthma, we know air pollution is bad, and it's a risk factor for a kid showing up at a hospital a day or two later with an asthma attack. What about mental health exacerbations? It's a big, big issue in Cincinnati. I'm sure it's a big issue here in Toledo. It's a big issue nationwide. Why are all these mental health exacerbations happening? And so what we did was design a study that allows us to answer that question. Is short-term exposure to higher levels of air pollution associated with an increased risk of a kid coming to our emergency room at Cincinnati Children's Hospital because of an acute mental health exacerbation? But we use satellite data to actually estimate air pollution exposure every single day at every point in the United States. So we can model your exposure at your house with this model on any single day from 2000 all the way up to October of last year. So we can use this model and estimate exposure to air pollution for the kids that are coming to the hospital in Cincinnati and look at whether or not higher levels of air pollution are associated with an increased risk of coming to the hospital with an exacerbation of a mental health outcome. And this data, what I'm highlighting here in the arrows, are those that we saw statistically significant increased risks for with air pollution exposure the day before they showed up. So the way to look at this is we pulled all the psychiatric emergency department visits from Cincinnati Children's Hospital for 5 years. So we had 13,000 of them. And then we broke it down into what type of disorder that they had, the reason they came to the hospital. And what we saw was that overall, we saw a significant increased risk one day before. So the day before they showed up, air pollution was higher in those kids that ended up coming to the hospital. We also saw it for mood disorders, adjustment disorders, externalizing disorders, and attempted suicides the day before. And the other thing I want to mention, coming back to that very first slide I showed about the social determinants of health. Again, kids are not exposed to air pollution in isolation, but they're exposed in the context of where they live, their communities, and all the other things that are going on. So when we looked at air pollution, and we looked at the neighborhood that they lived in, those kids that come from areas that have higher, what we call community deprivation, the air pollution affects them even more for things like suicidality and anxiety. And the opposite, if you're coming from a neighborhood with lower community deprivation and you have air pollution exposure, it looks like you're at an increased risk for adjustment disorders. So where you live kind of sets this platform for how other things affect you, in this case, air pollution exposure. You have these levels of chronic stress, and you add to them other things, and you have some of these health effects.
I want to see if I'm linking this correctly. This correlation between air pollution and mental health, is that associated with a slide you showed quite a while ago about the white and black difference? Or is that a separate factor that we're talking about?
Well, what I'll say is that air pollution tends to be higher in neighborhoods that have higher populations, percentages of black populations. It's not a direct link, but what I'm going to show you, we've looked at this before, going back to the slide that I talked about where there's this disproportionate level of exposure across the United States. So it's true in Cincinnati, it's true, probably true in Toledo, and it's true in many, many communities in the United States that neighborhoods with lower SES, higher levels of minority populations have higher levels of air pollution. And we can talk about, I don't have it here, but we've done research on things like redlining and historical zoning, why that ends up like it is. Those neighborhoods they correlate with each other.
I looked at the census data when the highway was first built. It opened in December of 1970. This was white population all the way from I-75 all the way out to US 23, maybe 99 point something of people or white population versus people of color. That is almost completely flipped from I-75 to Douglas Road, which has already been built out. And I-75 to Douglas Road, it is majority people of color. What I'm calling the central part, so from Douglas Road where this project picks up to Sylvania Township, which starts just after the mall, it's now about 60% white and 40% people of color. And even in the wealthier area in Sylvania Township, as you get past the mall and out further, it's when it was 100% white back in 1970, it's now about 80%, 20% people of color. And as you heard me announce at the beginning of this, ODOT themselves know that it's minority populations, senior citizens, people with limited English proficiency, which suggests they're immigrants into our city, and people on lower income scale. I would find a correlation with the kind of things Pat is saying about the communities of color probably are going to be hit hardest by the expansion of highways.
I'll try to wrap up here and talk a little bit about some of the new technologies that are out there with low-cost air sensors that allow you to start filling in the gaps of what air quality looks like in neighborhoods. Regulatory air monitoring, the Clean Air Act, the EPA is tasked with regulating 6 criteria pollutants. There they are. PM 2.5 is one of those. You can see the trends over the years. That ends in 2018. If you were to continue, you will see a little uptake. In the 2000s, you'll see COVID go down, and then you'll see an uptake again. What I want you to take away from this is the EPA, 2 things. One is the EPA way of measuring air pollution is very, very regulated. They must use what they call federal reference methods and federal reference method equipment. It costs $40,000 plus to buy the equipment. They have to do it in a highly followed protocol documentation. They use mass concentrations, they weigh it on filters, and it's a 24-hour average concentration. That's one takeaway. So you don't see the increases and decreases by the hour that you would see if you were to measure air pollution constantly, because it kind of gets averaged away on the way of air sampling that they do. Secondly, they are designed to measure background concentrations. The idea of the Clean Air Act is that for a given area, the air quality should be clean. They intentionally, when they cite regulatory air monitors, until very recently, they cite them in areas that's going to give you a general background picture of what the air quality looks in an area. They don't want, in their regulatory monitoring, to cite something right next to an interstate or a factory that's going to give them very high readings because of that location. That's changed a little bit. There are some near roadway monitors now, but for the most part, they're sparsely located background concentrations. And so what happens is you get, and this is a paper that just got published last year, about 40% of urban locations and 20 million residents aren't really being represented by the EPA regulatory monitoring network. They live in a neighborhood that has a source of air pollution that's not being captured by that monitoring site. Residents of those spots, disproportionately people of color and lower income. In the last 10 years or so, we have started to use, and many others have started to use, low-cost air monitors. And the advantage of these kind of air monitors, and I have one of them here that I'm going to talk about in a second, is that you can put these in your neighborhood, you can put them outside your house, and you can help fill in the gaps between what might be two EPA regulatory air monitors that are miles apart, and you can put these low-cost air sensors that give you a picture of what's going on in between because of interstates, because of factories, because of whatever might be in between that's not being captured by those monitoring sites. So here's two of them that we use in a lot of our studies. One of them is called the Purple Air. It is a stationary device. It measures PM 2.5, PM 10, and also smaller particles. It's pretty accurate, it's very reliable. It gives you a 5-second resolution if you want, so you can start measuring air pollution exposures every couple minutes, basically. You can see the patterns of air quality going up and down at these sites. Costs about $300. You hook it to your Wi-Fi, and you can share your data with the Purple Air community. So if you go to purpleair.com, you will see thousands of Purple Air monitors feeding data across the United States and worldwide. EPA has actually looked into this device to the point where they will allow it to be used for their smoke air monitoring network, so wildfire smoke exposure, because they can quickly deploy these devices in areas that are affected by wildfire smoke. The other one that we use a lot is the one I'm holding in my hand right now. It's called an AirBeam. The latest version of the AirBeam uses the exact same sensor inside to count the particles, called the Plantower sensor. They both, obviously it's the same sensor, they operate the same way. The difference here is that there's no Wi-Fi connection with this, there's a Bluetooth connection, so you have to use their app. If you connect this to the app on your cell phone, you can start measuring PM 2.5 exposure, and the app actually will give you a map. I'm going to show you some data that we get from these devices. So we've used these devices. In Cincinnati, there's a neighborhood called Lower Price Hill. It is a neighborhood that is affected by a number of environmental exposures. I won't go through all of these right now, but it has a lot of manufacturing, traffic sources, no green space essentially, and the life expectancy in Lower Price Hill is the lowest in the city, 25 years lower than the highest neighborhood in the city. We've worked with community partners there to establish a network of Purple Air monitors, and I'm just going to show you some data that I hope highlights the type of information you can get from these devices. So we put 12 Purple Air monitors up in Lower Price Hill, and we compared them to the EPA monitoring site that the EPA uses to issue air quality alerts in Cincinnati. And what we did was, for every day, this is 2 summers ago now, we subtracted the AQI from Lower Price Hill from the one at EPA. So positive numbers here mean that the air quality in Lower Price Hill was that much higher, or that much worse, higher is worse, than the EPA monitoring site that's giving you the background. 4.6 was the highest. All of these are statistically significantly higher than the EPA monitoring site. Air quality in Lower Price Hill was significantly worse than the air quality at the EPA monitoring site. And the other thing we did was we looked at how many days an air quality alert was issued at Cincinnati using that background EPA monitoring data versus if an air quality alert would be triggered using the actual purple air in the community. And what we saw, this is one summer, there were about 4 to 6 days that an air quality alert may have been triggered had they used air quality data from that neighborhood, but was not triggered. So that's the kind of information that you can get from putting out low-cost monitors in your neighborhoods to start measuring air quality. Now there are limitations, and I'm happy to talk about those. The EPA will not accept the data from these types of devices because it's not their federal reference method, there's not federal equivalent. There's actually lawsuits involved now with several states that specifically are not allowing citizen scientists and community members to use low-cost air monitoring data in lawsuits. That being said, they're still out there. You can still monitor the data and report that and look at it. Personal PM2.5, you can measure that using the purple air. It has a little carpenter clip here. You can put it on yourself. We ask people to wear it for a week, and I just want to highlight that personal air quality can really, really get bad if you do certain things, especially in this case, smoking. You can see 2 of our participants were smokers, and they spent about 70% of their time in an AQI level that would be considered unhealthy to hazardous to their health. So the takeaway is air pollution exposure is personal. Neighborhood personal exposure frequently exceeds the outdoor measurements, especially for kids, because they spend more time outside. These are pictures I've taken. I've done school bus studies where we look at idling. These are like personal hotspots of exposure that place you at higher levels that just aren't captured by those EPA monitoring sites. This is a school in Cincinnati that's right next to I-75 and 275. You can see their track is right here. We've done air quality studies there as well, showing how bad the air quality can get outside at their football stadium. The last thing I'm going to mention, I think, is community engaged research. You know, the power of residents' lived experiences to inform research questions, I think is a way that we need to be doing more and more research. This is a project that we did in a neighborhood in Cincinnati called Norwood. They were interested in air pollution, but also urban heat islands. And so what we did here with them was design a study to use air beams, combine that with eyewitness community surveys, so cell phone triggered questionnaires that they could answer as they walked around their neighborhood, and then questionnaires about their overall well-being. What we did was, in the personal study, we gave them air beams and we asked them to walk on specific routes through their neighborhoods, measuring air pollution exposure multiple times per day over multiple seasons. And what I'm showing here is just the PM2.5 data. And the takeaway here is that it changes depending on summer versus winter, day by day. Here, the highest level of exposures were in the summer of 2021. In their neighborhood. But again, you know, just the power of using these types of devices to measure a personal exposure in your neighborhood, give you a picture of what's going on. And then the very last thing I'm going to mention is a plug for a training grant that I have that we call Research Innovations using Sensor Technology and Environmental Justice Communities, RISE Communities. And the goal of this training grant is specifically to train teams of academic and community partners who want to use these types of low-cost air sensors in their neighborhoods. If you're accepted to our training program, and we're accepting applications right now, that QR code will take you to our website. What we do is we bring you to Cincinnati, we talk about how you set these devices up, we talk about the pros and the cons of different devices. We also do a lot of team building activities. So the goal is to make strong academic community team. Our goal is to have a partner from a university or a local health department partner with a community resident or a community organization that wants to use these types of devices. We do team building, team science training activities, but also technical activities, and we give the teams 10 of those purple air monitors to go out and establish sensor networks in their neighborhoods, in their communities. So we've done that now for 3 years. We're going to do our last, it's a 5-year study, we're going to do our last one this coming year. So if you're interested, send us an application. I'm thrilled that there was a group in our first cohort who was just featured in the American Lung Association's State of the Air report. So if you pull up the latest State of the Air report, they used air monitoring in their neighborhood in Louisville, Kentucky. They wrote a report. The city actually listened to them, changed some of the regulations around that site. And they've published that now, and they were highlighted in the American Lung Association's annual report. I'm hoping that these teams that are doing great things out in the neighborhoods can make an impact in their communities. So I'm going to end there. I talked all of this stuff. There's a lot that we do. None of it is by myself. There's massive amount of people and teams. We've been doing this for 25 years. These are some of the folks that have been involved throughout the years at the University of Cincinnati, Cincinnati Children's. I work with a group at Harvard a bit, across the country in our local community organization called Groundwork ORV. All of our funding comes from NIH. Let's keep NIH being funded. I'm happy to take any questions or talk about anything else. Thanks.
Yeah. You may have said this. How many purple air monitors are in Cincinnati?
Well, Cincinnati, we had a team come to our training, and they got really involved, and the city of Cincinnati actually decided to invest in those. And we have 52 neighborhoods in Cincinnati. The goal of Cincinnati, the city government, is to put at least one purple air in every neighborhood. So we have, I think they have 45 out of the 52 hooked up, ready to go. And then there's neighborhood, individual citizens just putting up purple air. So I don't know, there's probably 60 or 70 now in Cincinnati.
Great. Let me tell you that there are two in Toledo. One is on Savage Hall, and one is on Fifth Third Field. At least the last time I looked, which was, I don't know, 2-3 months ago. We have two. For my purposes, as far as measuring highway exposure, we're not gathering that information on highway. If you write to City Council out of your packet here, you have all the addresses. Let's figure out a way to bring purple air monitors here would be one of the goals that I would see that we could get to. Anybody has questions for Pat?
The question was how user-friendly how accessible are the papers that we've written? All the papers, not just that one. So everything we publish is peer-reviewed. Everything is available. There's a couple of ways you can get it. One is we have a website. Admittedly, it's out of date. So if it was published in the last 7 or 8 years, it's probably not on our website. But it is available if you, Google's probably the easiest way anymore. Or if you use AI, they do good searches. Or pubmed.gov is the official website we must upload our papers to if we're funded by NIH. They have a search bar just like Google. You can search for it, you can find it that way. They should be freely available because they're now requiring the journals to make these papers freely available. If you run across a paper that you can't click on the link and download it for free, send me an email and I can send it to you. Any of them should be out there and available.
And I was able to access every one of those and then some. Believe me, this man is well published.
I'm wondering about sound barriers. I don't think they do much for sound. but by any chance do they contain some of the pollutants?
You know, it's an interesting question because it hasn't been really thoroughly studied. So there is some data. It's kind of mixed. They are physical barriers, right? But they're not, super tall. So there's actually some data that, the pollutants, depending on the wind direction, can go over and actually, depending on the wind, almost miss the houses that are right next to it and then kind of dissipate out a little bit because of the transformations and the wind pattern. So I would say that it's not an answered question what the physical barriers, the noise barriers do. They're doing something, but I don't know exactly what the concentrations are. And I'm not aware, maybe somebody has done a really thorough study of different distances, wind directions, and heights and things like that. But I'm not aware, I don't know. The other question that we get a lot, though, along those same lines is green space, physical trees. Some evidence that they are physical barriers might reduce some pollution, but again, I don't know anyone at this point. We just submitted a grant to look at what green space does to air quality using some of these low-cost sensors, but I haven't seen anyone thoroughly answer the question to give you a definitive answer. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
I actually know what the sound walls do.
There you go.
I read a study from 1976 that children who were growing up in communities by highways and did not have any kind of sound remediation were deaf to the sounds of shh, shh, and could also not speak them. So those sound barriers are designed specifically to stop the frequency of sound. which is a high-pitched frequency. So all the sounds that are bugging all of us are usually, and that's all.
Yeah, and just to add to that, noise is another environmental exposure that roadways bring that have health effects. So there is a good body of literature that the noise itself can cause health effects, more on the cardiovascular stress-related outcomes, because it's no fun to listen to that type of noise when you try to sleep and things like
And
that.
I'll
So.
add real quickly too, because we've used the CDC-approved phone app to measure noise in properties that are adjacent to the highway. You start to lose your hearing at 70 decibels. We were measuring at 6:40 in the morning, I think it was, 110 it was peaking in one property literally next to a sound wall. The other property did not have a sound wall, and inside their home, they were getting peaks of 102 inside their home.
Have any air quality studies been conducted that compared the before and after of projects similar to the 475 project?
Not that I'm aware of, but that doesn't mean that it's not out there. I will look. That's an interesting question. Not with highways, because they usually take so long to build. I am aware, actually, now that you say that, in Syracuse, there's been an issue where they want to tear down a highway and rebuild it, and I know that they were trying to do some pre-post. Health effects are the challenge when you do those kind of things, because it's usually spread out over such a long period of time that it's hard to capture the health effects before and after. Yeah. But that doesn't mean somebody hasn't done it. I'll look. We've been trying to do it with green space a lot. The idea, if you plant trees, does that help the air quality? Does that help the temperatures? Does that help health outcomes? And even that's difficult because trees take a long time to get big and grow and things like that. So I don't know is my answer, I'm sorry. I mean, idling is an issue because it does produce traffic. I think the data here that Peggy was telling me is it doesn't seem to be much of an issue now. And I think the risk is the increased volume of traffic.
My question was, has all of your work led to Cincinnati being able to stop highway expansions?
No, is the answer. I mean, we have in Cincinnati, the Brent Spence Bridge is being built, redone, built. There's going to be a new one we were talking about. So, you know, that's the bridge that carries 71 and 75 across the Ohio River. It is old, out of date, way too crowded. I get all that. The latest plan I heard is they're going to build another bridge next to it, and when that's finished, they're going to have two bridges, and they're going to have to draw, essentially, one will be northbound, one will be southbound, and they're expanding I-75 similarly to this project in the downtown Cincinnati area because they're going to need these more lanes to feed the two bridges in the future. So the same issue is going on in Cincinnati right now, and I would say that there's no stoppage of that. I mean, people always ask, you know, like, what can we do? Is a common question, right? I can't move, things like that. I have, you know, the data we produce, I hope, causes some regulatory public health policies, things like, you know, moving truck traffic around loops or something that where there's less population, things like that. I don't know if, you know, that'll happen or not. But I do think there are individual level things. I'm much more optimistic about local policymakers. So, you know, the city of Cincinnati, I don't think has much say in whether or not the federal government builds a new bridge over the Ohio River. But they do have a say in some of the things like the purple air monitors or the idling policies of the city or where schools can be sited or zoning things. And I think those are where we have more say with local data like this. And then individually, there are ways to change your indoor environment. Some of them are low cost. Air filters are very effective. HEPA air filters work very well, but you don't even need to have a HEPA filter necessarily. There are low cost options to build box fan filters. That's what they actually recommend for wildfire smoke exposure. So you can build very cheap air filters in your homes using furnace filters and a cheap box fan you buy from, like, you know, Ace or Home Depot or something like that. And they do a good job of cleaning the particles out of your air. They won't take care of the gaseous pollutants, but they'll take the particles out pretty well. In the room that they're in anyway. Yeah.
Speaking of particles, just for context, we're all familiar with the N95.
Yep.
Where does that land in particle size?
So it gets down into the very, very small particles because that's the efficiency that they're looking at. So the viruses are in the very small range. It filters them out. So masking is another, the N95s.
Particle spit that would go from
It'll get that. That's not a problem. Will it get the smallest ultrafines? No. Small, but not the tiniest. But they're pretty effective, and masking is another strategy that in wildfire smoke that some physicians will recommend, masking for short times if you're concerned about an acute exposure. Go ahead.
It seems that your research is the argument for electric vehicles.
Well, there's always caveats. So I drive an electric vehicle. I think that it's a good idea in general. The analyses of, the argument that you burn more coal because of, there's a lot of issues, that's wrong. But those electric vehicles I mentioned, they do still produce particles because there's tire wear and brake wear. And it's actually because of the regenerative braking on electric vehicles, you actually produce a little bit more of those particles. So there are researchers out there doing some studies of the types of particles that are being produced, not because of the combustion of gasoline in it, because there is none, right, in an EV, but because of the pollutants that are being emitted from the tire wear on the road, which is a little bit higher than a truck or a car, a gasoline power or diesel power, because they don't have the regenerative braking. It's much lower though. It's not zero, it's not at the same level, but there is some level. And they're a little bit different particles too. So back to the very beginning, the composition is a little bit different because instead of the particles coming from burning the gasoline or the diesel, it's coming from the tire wear. So the particles composition is a little different. That being said, they're better in general.
They got bring everything home now. Put up the slides for us of the map of the neighborhoods to show how many people live within 40 meters.
I will invite you to answer Rick's question. There is a map on the table with the map. There's two visuals back there. One is I-475 at Secor Road 3 days before Christmas in December of last year. And I know that we all know what Secor Road looks like as far as retail, regional, commercial. 3 days before Christmas in the busiest retail shopping area in town. The other is the map. The top map was ODOT's map of our neighborhoods. The bottom map was we went to the auditor's office and said, give us a more accurate map of actual land use, because ODOT said every building that they had as a commercial building that was actually residential, you will see circles in the bottom map around, and these are real people. So if single family property owners were discounted in this, and believe you me, we've never been invited to the table. We own property there, and you'd think that we would have a stake in it, that we would be one of the stakeholders because of our investment. People who live in apartments, and I don't know, I bet you I wouldn't get a single person here to not raise their hand. Either you started life in an your adult life in an apartment, or you're gonna end your adult life in an apartment. And apartment people do not count at all. They're treated as part of commercial, just like an air fryer on the shelf at some store. So the idea of the disrespect that ODOT has shown, this is my personal opinion, they've been nothing but disrespectful to the people who live nearby. And tonight, as I announced, it's just further evidence. What did we not learn here about the harms that can come from the close proximity? And they are announcing on TV there are no harms. They're harming nobody. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. A good turnout.